the middle of the road for epistemology, the intermediary space between objectivism and subjectivism, is constructionism. And it's kind of odd to use the word knowledge because knowledge has so many built-in assumptions in the Western tradition, at least. It has baggage, philosophical baggage with objectivism, knowledge about reality itself, knowledge corresponding to the objects of reality. But in constructionism, it's less tethered to the object and more focused on the meaning that is constructed about the object through experience with the object. So let's state that another way. Knowledge or meaning, and meaning is more often used with constructionism. Meaning comes from an interaction between the object and the subject. The object is the known, and the subject is the knower. So when the knower studies the known or the to be known, they construct meaning about that object. This video here is worth your time to watch. It's called The Blind Men and the Elephant. And just to give you the gist of the video, there are, I think it's, five blind men. And they each are subjects in the world. They're conscious subjects. And they're trying to understand an object, what we know as an elephant, what we have understood and described as an elephant. And each one of them has a direct experience with a single part, an incomplete part, one dimension of what an elephant is. So constructionism might say that each of these people only sees part of the object from a perspective, from a limited, narrow perspective. And the moral of the story is that we shouldn't jump to conclusions that we have the absolute comprehensive truth in any set of beliefs about the world, that we should be more epistemologically humble and more pluralist in our understanding of knowledge, that we should be more tolerant and open-minded to reasonable alternatives to describe reality. So if this blind man only has experience with an elephant's tail, he might say an elephant is like a snake. And this other guy has experience with the hoof. So he might say it's like a tree trunk, right? And you get the point, right? This guy might be feeling on the tusk of the elephant, and it's sharp. And he says, this is like a sword. An elephant is like a sword. But really, an elephant isn't like any single one of those things, but an elephant has multiple components or qualities that each of these blind men has a perspective on. Okay, so Michael Crotty, who has written a lot, he's a foundational thinker in social research. He says there is no objective truth waiting for us to discover it. Truth or meaning, see, he's conflating these two terms, saying that truth is the same thing as meaning. That's very much a constructionist point of view. He's collapsing a conceptual distinction that has traditionally been made in especially the English-speaking world between truth and belief or meaning that people make. Because truth assumes a certain level of objectivity and direct correspondence to reality, whereas meaning is more subjective. So truth or meaning comes into existence in and out of our engagement with the realities of our world. Meaning is not discovered, but constructed. So if a scientist goes out and starts to study a population of people, they're not discovering truth about people. They're not discovering objective knowledge about people, about their behaviors, about their qualities, their beliefs, and so on. They are making meaning. They are constructing meaning about these subjects, about human beings that are the object of their study. In this view of things, the subject and object emerge as partners in the generation of meaning. So the knowing subject interacts with the known object to construct or to generate meaning. So to a constructionist, meaning is knowledge. They're the same thing. These are used synonymously by constructionists. Constructionists would have a realist ontology, at least that's the way Crotty understands it, that there is a real world, objects exist in reality independent of our consciousness, but without consciousness there is no meaning. Conscious subjects interpret and ascribe meaning to objects. This makes sense to me, but it's different from what Guba and Lincoln said on the previous page. Remember, they were saying that reality doesn't exist. It can't exist until subjects make meaning of it. That's an idealist ontology. That's more associated with subjectivist epistemology. Okay, so constructionism has a relativist account of meaning. So a realist ontology, but a relativist account of meaning. Not necessarily radical relativism or pure subjectivism, where any belief is just as good as any other belief or just as warranted with reasons and evidence. But constructionists don't really aim to get to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. They don't believe that there is a one single best explanation of the world. They're more of pluralists in the sense that they believe there are multiple reasonable interpretations, and the goal of inquiry is to identify those multiple reasonable interpretations and sort of elevate those above some of the less constructive, less helpful interpretations. So Crotty says there is no true or valid interpretation. And I think he means there's no single absolute objective truth or knowledge or absolutely valid, warranted interpretation. Useful, liberating, fulfilling, rewarding interpretations, yes. True or valid interpretations, no. So I guess truth and correspondence to reality are not really the goals of constructionist epistemology or studies guided by that. Really creating useful, liberating, fulfilling, rewarding interpretations, that's the goal of constructionist epistemology, is to construct meanings and interpretations that are beneficial for society. Subjectivism is a lot more extreme than constructionism. It's the polar opposite of objectivism. So if objectivism says that all of the content of a knowledge claim, that everything in a knowledge claim comes from the object itself and not from the knower or the subject. Subjectivism is the other extreme, the idea that meaning comes from the subject. So this would be the blue pill in the Matrix. Objectivism would be the red pill. So if the world does not exist at all, unless I think about it or am conscious about it, that's a blue pill kind of understanding. Whereas the world exists independently and I need to learn about it through experience, that's more of a red pill understanding. Subjectivists believe that meaning does not come out of an interplay between the subject and object, but is imposed on the object by the subject. So objects in and of themselves have no meaning whatsoever. They might not even exist. The subject constructs or create. I don't think they would use the word constructs. They would say that meaning is wholly derived from the subject's consciousness. Nothing comes from the object. Or if it does, we can't know that. So why even talk about it? What the focus would be is on the subjective meaning. So the object, that is, an independently existing entity of reality, makes no contribution to the generation of meaning. So this is neither objectivist nor constructionist. It is purely focused on the subject and consciousness creating meaning. Meaning is created in the mind. So through dreams, through collective consciousness among multiple human beings in a society, culturally generated belief, and so on. So this has an element of mysticism to it. It's as if the beliefs come first, and all that other stuff is less real somehow. So it's the ideals, the consciousness itself, the rational self is primary to the physical and chemical objects and properties of the world. That they are less real. This is subjectivist epistemology is at the heart of postmodernism and some of the identity-oriented critical theories. So if they're constructionist in epistemology, they're leaning heavily in the subjectivist direction on the continuum, with postmodernism being at that extreme end. This is primarily because of the emphasis of critical theories in postmodernism on axiology more so than epistemology or ontology. And what I mean by that is the focus is on values more so than facts. The focus is on ethics, politics, or aesthetics, which is like art and beauty, the study of beauty. As a component of social research paradigms, axiology deals primarily with the ways in which human interests and values influence the research process and presumably its products. So a subjectivist, a postmodernist, a critical theorist would likely say that science is also every bit as subjective as critical theory, as postmodern scholarship. They would just say that scientists are naive about their subjectivity, that they think that they're being objective, but really it's just their various identity groups imposing their subjective beliefs onto the world through an exercise of power, an arbitrary exercise of power. So this is a very relativist approach to knowledge. It's either relativist or it's selectively applied relativism. Critical theory, postmodernism, some of the more subjectivist leaning paradigms might suggest that the oppressed people's lived experiences and private knowledge ought to be given at least the same degree of epistemic status, if not greater epistemic status, to the publicly warranted beliefs and truth claims of scientists, if those scientists happen to be straight white men, for example. All right, that's a much heavier emphasis on axiology than epistemology or ontology. Okay, as a component of social research paradigms, axiology deals primarily with the ways in which human interests and values influence the research process and presumably its products. Habermas says that there are different knowledge constitutive interests. So he says that human beings have different interests and that these influence our research. Habermas says that the first orientation in social inquiry is knowledge for the explanation, prediction, and control of the social world. So this would be the technical interests, or the what I labeled with the orientations earlier as the empirical analytic orientation. So this would be like post-positivism and positivism as paradigms. Number two would be knowledge for understanding and interpretation. This would be the approach of the humanities, the interpretive approach. These Habermas calls the practical interests, to understand and interpret meaning, constructed meaning. And then thirdly, knowledge for change and transformation. what Habermas calls the emancipatory interests, which may be a little misleading because emancipation suggests that it is liberty-oriented or that it's aimed toward human freedom, but oftentimes it's aimed toward equality rather than liberty. So yes, equality and liberty are related, but they're conceptually different in some ways. So it may be more helpful to think of critical theory and postmodernism less about freedom and more about equality. As far as axiology goes, the researcher's values can influence the sort of inquiries, methodologies, questions, problems, and purposes that they find worthy. The judgments about which questions to ask, what data to collect, how to analyze it, etc. How the researcher chooses to represent their study's findings, arguments, and messages. So let's look at those three things in a little bit more detail. So first, how the researcher judges research worthiness, research quality. Okay, that involves value judgments. Judgments about which questions to ask, what data to collect, and how to analyze it. Those are also value judgments. So which questions are worthy for science, for example? Which ones should be funded by the government? What kind of data are the most reliable and valid warrants for knowledge? And so on. Those are all value judgments. Representation, what kind of rhetorical appeals are appropriate for scholarship? Is it just logos, logic, empirical evidence? Is it also ethos and pathos? I have a document in our Canvas website about rhetoric, and it goes into the differences between these. And various paradigms place greater and less emphasis on ethos, pathos, and logo. They also look at the degree of clarity and precision of language. So if one paradigm places a greater emphasis on clarity and precision, and another one might place a greater emphasis on the ability to compel action or to motivate change, sometimes clarity and precision are not the most exciting things. And if your goal is to evoke an emotional response in your audience and motivate them to fight for social justice, clarity and precision might not be the top of your value hierarchy. It might be something you value, but it might not be right up there at the very top. Aesthetic or literary qualities of the writing and imagery. A lot of postmodern scholarship places a great deal of emphasis on aesthetic quality. So is the work interesting? Is it novel? Is it evocative? Is it entertaining? Is it enjoyable to read? Those might be criteria that are deemed more valuable in postmodern scholarship than they would be in positivist scholarship, for example. How the researcher interacts with participants. For example, how formal or conversational to be. If you are a feminist researcher and you're doing an interview with women who have experienced some kind of trauma, you may want to have a less formal interview, more conversational, more relaxed, and more safe. Whereas if you're a psychologist and you're trying to be as objectivist as possible, you want to keep to the script. Okay, that means an etic approach to research. The researchers in charge of where the research is going. They're guided by theory, they're guided by purpose, they're guided by research questions. And their analysis of the data is emphasized above the subject's perception. So they may study a subject and say that, yeah, the subject believes this, or they say they believe this, but sometimes people lie. Or the subject believes this, they say they believe this, but I observed this, this, and this, which contradict those beliefs. So I think this is really what's going on. That's an etic approach. Whereas an emic approach is more non-judgmental. The researcher tries to play more of a neutral role as a reporter, not an interpreter. So it's more like, okay, these are the participants' meanings and their interests. This is how they make sense of the world in their own words, on their own terms. And that's more of an emic perspective. Okay, axiology also influences how much or how explicitly to emphasize their own political interests. So everybody has subjectivity, everybody has identity, everybody has interests and goals. And depending on how strong those beliefs are, that might influence how much emphasis they get in your project. It is at least hypothetically possible for some individuals to be more interested in the pursuit of objective truth than in the pursuit of political or ethical ends. It is at least hypothetically possible that some people are more focused on trying to make objectively true statements about the world, or to understand the world as clearly and accurately as possible on the one hand, or to change the world on the other hand. And the critical orientation is much more focused on changing the world for the better than on interpreting the world or on knowing the world to such a degree that you can predict or generalize accurately about it. So it really is a difference in values, a difference in the weighting of values. It's not that they don't care about truth, it's just that social justice is elevated above truth for the sake of truth. And values play a role in many other aspects of the research process. Okay, so let's connect these different elements with some concrete examples, because this was pretty abstract in many ways. So here are the elements. The paradigm, the research paradigm, which consists of ontology, or beliefs about reality, epistemology, or beliefs about knowledge or meaning, axiology, values, oftentimes ethical, political values, or other human interests. The methodology is guided by the paradigm, it's grounded in the philosophical foundations of the paradigm, and it is justified by these beliefs inherent in the paradigm. And then the methods that are used are guided by the methodology, the purpose, the questions, and so on, which are in turn guided by the paradigm. So here are some examples that are nice, neat little packages, and it doesn't always work out like this, but these are good teaching examples. So symbolic interactionism is a paradigm used in cultural anthropology, for example. So if someone is using a methodology of ethnography, it's oftentimes guided by symbolic interactionism in cultural anthropology. So the symbolic interactionists might believe, yes, there's a real world of people. They have a culture. Their culture is real. It exists. And it can be understood and interpreted. But in order to understand and interpret a culture, the researcher has to not only study constructed meaning, but construct their own interpretations and their own meanings of that constructed meaning. And this is guided by the practical interests. So it's guided by the humanities approach. So at least cultural anthropology has more in common with the humanities than it does with the natural sciences, for example. And we can get into more detail about that later. But ethnography can be guided by symbolic interactionism, and it can use the method of participant observation. So if you're going in to study a tribe in Papua New Guinea, and you're an outsider, and you're trying to understand their culture on their own terms, then it makes sense that you would have to experience the culture directly in order to construct any meaning or to co-construct meaning with the participants, to really understand their subjectivity. You might have to experience what they experience, eat the foods they experience, perform the rituals alongside them, learn their language, learn their customs, experience their art and the tools that they use, and so on. Participant observation can be contrasted with so quote unquote direct observation or fly on the wall observation. That's a more objectivist approach where the researcher tries not to interfere subjectively with the research process. Another example to kind of contrast with the first is positivism as a paradigm, realism as its ontology, objectivism as its epistemology, and the technical interests of prediction, generalization, and so on, would be the axiological commitments or the primary human knowledge constitutive interests that are emphasized in positivism. A methodology might be experimental research, which we've already talked about with laboratory-like conditions, looking at correlations, causation, trying to make accurate predictions, and so on. In order to make statistically warranted generalizations about a population from a sample, the sample has to be representative to make sure that a sample is representative of a population and that accurate claims about the population can be made from the data collected from the sample. You can contrast representative sampling in a positivist scientific approach to social science from purposive sampling, which is more common in qualitative research like ethnography, where you're selecting participants based on some predetermined criteria that makes them unique, makes them special, makes them stand out